If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, what are some unexplainable events or phenomenon that you've observed in real life? 1. When I was 8 years old, my friend Patrick and I were in the woods near our houses. We were pretty deep into the woods when all of a sudden we hear Patrick's mom calling us. There was no mistaking her voice, since she had a very unique Austrian accent. We keep hearing her calling out to us, and we finally make it to his house and asked his mom what she needed. She said she'd never called us. 2. This one is tricky, but I swear it happened. When I was between the ages of 7 to 9, I remember waking up one morning and seeing crawfish all over the streets and on people's lawns and cars. It had rained pretty viciously the night before, and my friend and I were running around picking up the crawfish and playing with them. They were all making their way to the streets and floating down into the sewers. My friend vaguely remembers this and my parents don't. I can't find record of this ever happening, newspaper, radio, etc. However, there are records of animals raining down from the sky in other parts of the world. Someone had suggested it may have been a tornado. 3. When I went to Ireland in the spring of 2000 for a school trip, we were staying at a hotel in this little town by a beach. Everyone on the trip ended up going to this club to party it up, and my girlfriend and I, along with another couple, went to a nearby casino/arcade to play some games. We played for a bit and called it an early night and made our way back to the hotel. Everyone else was still out partying. The next day we all wake up for breakfast, pack our bags, and get back on the bus. Everyone is there except for one guy, Gilbert. The chaperones start freaking out, thinking Gilbert may have wandered into the ocean while he was drunk and drowned. He wasn't in his room or in anyone else's room, so the hotel management starts going floor by floor and room by room looking for Gilbert. The girls on the bus start crying, expecting the worst. The adults are all freaking out. After about an hour, they find Gilbert. He's exactly one floor up from the room he was supposed to be in, 615 instead of 515, for example. Nobody knows how he got into his room, as that room was not rented out and that floor was empty except for one other guest. Everybody, including the staff, was baffled. 4. Before my first day of starting at a new private school in a new town, I had a nightmare involving this horrific abstract human face. Everywhere I would look in my dream, this face would appear, and it was quite an unsettling visage. I woke up ready for school, a little bit shaken up by this dream, but thought nothing of it. On Friday, at the end of my first week at this new school, we were required to go to Mass. Upon walking into the church, the face that had haunted my dreams several nights before was the same face that was on the postmodern/abstract crucifix hanging above the altar. I had never set up in that church prior to that point. 5. A few months ago, I was at home, chilling in my living room, and I saw an intense flash of light fill up the living room for a brief moment, followed by a boom that sounded like a cross between thunder and an explosion. It shook the house and set off car alarms in the neighborhood. Other neighbors heard it too, and we stepped outside to see what had caused it. There wasn't a sign of anything having caused this, not a cloud in the sky, no contrails overhead, or jet noises before the boom, no indication of an explosion. It was just so random. The thing that bothers me is not so much the boom, but the flash of light. It was in the middle of the day, so it had to have been pretty bright to lighten up my living room more than it already was. Additionally, I have some thick-ass wooden blinds that will keep most light out, so for light to have gotten past them, whatever the flash was, it was bright. One time in high school I was testing the waters before I was going to bed. While listening to music, I was getting into paranormal stuff at that time, and I got enough courage to say, "If anyone is here, give me a sign." Right after I finished that, my music turned to static, then became louder. At this point in time I was freaking out and paralyzed with fear. After a few seconds, which felt like 20, I said stop out loud, and just like before, it stopped right when I told it to. Can't really explain it, but I've never tried anything like that again. So this was back in 2006 when I was 16 and worked at a chain pretzel shop at my local mall. Now, this is during the dead afternoon days of the summer. Usually there would just be one person manning the satellite store, as there was the main one upstairs, and the satellite store downstairs. I took care of both the satellite pretzel store and the ice cream store that was attached to it. At this particular time, I'm that one person. The day was going by pretty slowly, and with no windows, time would often stand still. The cameras where the upstairs store could watch us at all time made it pretty hard to text people and to have any distractions. Regardless, at some unknown time, a family of 3, mother, daughter, and young son, stopped some distance from the counter and stare at me and the pretzels. I would not have thought it to be odd except for how they were dressed. They looked like they came straight out of the 1950s, like this. The son was much younger and was in 1950s style clothing as well. I'm thinking how weird this could possibly be, but then realized that right upstairs there was a professional photoshoot franchise, so they were probably dressed up for some photos. It was not until the little boy came up to the counter and asked for a pretzel. I told him the price, $2.66, and he handed me a $1 bill. I motioned to the mother that the pretzel cost $2.66 and he was $1.66 short. She looked at me like I told her the pretzel cost $10, because I understand that almost $3 for a pretzel is high. However, she looked at me as if I wanted her to fork over her life savings. The little boy, not talking, hands me the dollar. I take a hard stare at it and realize it's a silver certificate, Series 1957. And this dollar bill did not look like it was 49 years old. It had normal wear and tear like a Series 2003 bill had the time. It wasn't crisp, but it was still very much usable and a bank would probably use it for further transactions. At this point I realized that nobody else really crossed their paths the entire time, and the music/media store next door was pretty dead, even for a midsummer afternoon, while pedestrian traffic just seemed to not exist. I hand the dollar back to the boy, and he walks away with his mother and sister. I didn't see them afterward and nobody was witness to this account. After constant prodding, I was finally able to look at the cameras looking towards the satellite store. I was obviously talking to customers, but the camera was angled so that you couldn't see any of them. About 4 years ago some friends and I were outside, it was around 12 to 1 a.m. and we're playing some stupid game. All of a sudden in the sky to the front of me I see 3 triangular objects with multicolor lights, in a non-normal aircraft configuration, but thought nothing of it because I was about 30 minutes from MacDill AFB. They are just an AMC base, but they do hold CENTCOM and SOCOM. Then it gets weird, one of the object's lights turn off, and then reappear in a completely different part of the sky in a matter of seconds, then they all start doing it, not constantly but every minute or so. So now I'm like WTF and start yelling at my friend to get over here. He finally comes just as one of them stops, so he missed it but did see the objects. I told him what was going on and he looked at me like an idiot. I told him give it a chance, he waits, then they do it again and Hess like WTF. These lights have appeared on and off every 3 to 6 months since then in the same location. 2. Not really unexplained or paranormal, but about a year ago I stepped outside my house. It was around 11:30 p.m. and I look up. In the sky I see a full moon, but the weird part was there was a perfect circle about 3x the size of the moon surrounding the moon. Normally I would have dismissed it, but this circle was perfect, misty clouds everywhere except where the moon was. I'm sure it's explainable, it was just odd. My girlfriend's father's metalworking shop is a very old concrete building, which half burnt down in the 1960s, supposedly killing a few workers. It was since then fixed and he's owned it since the early 1990s. A few of her family members have seen, heard things in the building. Even her father, who is a non-believer in the supernatural, has had a few unexplained things happen to him while he is there alone, such as whistling a song and stop and hear an unexplained voice finish the tune. But I digress. While we are there we always have the radio on. The station we listen to is a strange station. When I say strange I mean you can't pick it up anywhere else in the area, not even in a car right outside of the shop. It's a station that plays music from around the time the place burned. There is one spot in the shop that if you stand there it causes interference with the antenna wire and makes the radio go extremely static. This is confirmed and repeatable. Anyway, her father had just left to go grab some stuff to eat and I was there alone. I was doing fine until I heard a tool drop and then the radio repeated that same static noise as if someone was standing in that spot. Upon further investigation I couldn't find a damn thing. Let's just say I was waiting for him outside when he arrived. This happened to me a couple of years ago, when there still used to be smoking compartments in trains. Some friends and I were going home by train, when me and a friend decided to go for a cigarette. When we were on our way to the smoking compartment, we suddenly found ourselves in a part of the train that didn't look like anything we'd ever seen before. Everything from the grounds, the seats to the ceiling was chrome. What made it even stranger, this part of the train was packed with old people, and by old I mean 80 years plus, and we could smell them. It's not that they smelled unwashed or anything like that, but just old, like the kind of smell you get in a retirement home. The people were just sitting there, staring at us. None of them spoke a word while we made our way through the compartment, but they all looked at us as if we were ghosts. We left the compartment, and got back in the normal part of the train again, where my friend and I both realized that we experienced exactly the same and just how surreal that was. We smoked a cig, and decided to go back to our other friends, and were pretty nervous about going through that strange part again. However, this time the train was completely normal, no sign of chrome or any old people at all. The most frustrating part was that none of the other guys believed a word of what we said when we explained to them our fucked up experience and said we either made it up or smoked some crazy shit. My family and I used to go camping a lot when I was younger. Camping consisted of renting a cabin in the woods and spending a little time in the wilderness. So we consistently rented this cabin in Pennsylvania where we would spend long weekends, when everyone in the family had some time off. My two brothers and I, each being in the 9 to 12-year-old range, would always run off into the woods and bullshit about while my parents did whatever. The cabin was on a mountain. If you followed a dirt road a ways past the cabin, the forest would open and then there was a large field on the top. The field was about the size of a football field. Near the edge of the field, on the far side, was a graveyard. The graveyard was pretty small, about 20 graves, surrounded by a wrought iron fence. The fence was about 10 to 12 feet tall with the Gothic-ish spikes on the top. The fence had a gate but it was locked with a thick, rusty chain and padlock. Being kids were able to spread the gates apart enough to squeeze through. The small gravestones were very old and worn. I remember seeing one dated 1890 something. On top of one of the graves, just resting on it, was a smooth black stone. It looked like onyx or something, a little smaller than a golf ball but not perfectly round. My older brother pocketed it, we digged around a little then left. Back at the cabin, which had one bedroom where my parents stayed, and large living room/kitchen, where we stayed, we were hanging out while my parents were sleeping in bed. It was probably about 11:30 or so at night when a loud bang, 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 happened at the front door, which is right in the living room. Me and my brothers were all scared shitless, understandably too afraid to answer the door. Bang, bang, bang. Again the door shook moments later. It sounded like someone was trying to knock it off the hinges. My father emerged from the bedroom asking WTF was going on. Bang. The door clashed. He knew by the looks on our faces we had no idea. He grabbed a wood chopping axe we had and walked over to the door. He looked scared shitless himself. He swung the door open and there was nothing but the night. No one in sight. After hounding us for information, and us having no idea, we went back to bed. I think no one slept much, if at all that night. The next day we were back to dicking around in the woods and we again found ourselves in the old graveyard. The smooth black stone, that my brother took, was on top of the same grave. We ran fast. Shortly after my wife and I got married we were spending Thanksgiving with her parents and her brother and sister. I went to sleep at night and had this crazy fucked up dream about a farmhouse with a store in it that had a chicken coop in the back of the house, and behind the chicken coop there was one of those old time wells like a wishing well. I walked out back and was drawn to the well like it was pulling me like a black hole, and there were these green monster things coming out of it that were obviously trying to murder me. It was incredibly vivid and it scared the fuck out of me to the point that I bolted awake and was drenched in sweat. I hardly ever have nightmares, so it really stuck out in my mind. That morning at breakfast I told the family the story, and as I was telling it I noticed that my wife, her brother and her sister turned white as fucking sheets, and the parents got this really strange look on their face as well. I asked what the deal was and they said that I had just perfectly described a recurring nightmare that all three of them had as children, and then my in-laws went and dug out an old photo album that had pictures of the exact house/store, chicken coop, and water well in the backyard. It was the house my mother-in-law grew up in, and she swore up and down that it was haunted. I had never heard that story, never seen those pictures, and didn't know a single thing about it, and yet somehow I exactly described it to them. We all thought it was pretty crazy that I had the same nightmare they did when they were growing up. When my parents got divorced, my mom moved into a brand new house with me and my three siblings. I was the oldest and got my own room. One night, pretty soon after we moved in, I was lying on my side, trying to fall asleep. I was just staring at my new furniture, which had been a birthday present. One of the pieces had a full-length mirror on the front, and between blinks, I suddenly found myself staring at a little-ish blonde girl, probably 9, wearing a pink fancy dress, admiring herself in the mirror. She was moving slightly, just to sort of fluff out the skirt and have her ringlets bounce. We didn't interact at all. She just stood there, and was gone a few moments later. Thinking I was hallucinating/dreaming, and not being terribly disturbed by it, I never really talked about it. I just never slept with my back to that side of the room. Flash forward about 5 years later. My dad had taken us camping with his wife, her kids and a family. We're all talking around the campfire about the freaky things we've experienced in our lives, and my younger sister starts telling a story about the house we used to live in with our mom. She'd since moved to a new house. In her story, She walked into her closet to get something and had seen a girl playing with some toys that had been left in the closet. They exchanged the look, but it wasn't scary, and my sister closed the door, and that was it. Immediately, I'm getting goosebumps, although it could have been because we were camping in January. I asked my sister about the girl's appearance, and before I know it, we're finishing each other's sentences about her hair, her age, her clothes, the feeling of odd calm we both experienced. It was just freaky. After we were done, everyone around the campfire was convinced we were just the best storytellers ever and we'd set the whole thing up. If only we were that good. When I was around 18 or so, I had been living in a hotel with my mother and sister. We had lost most of our house to a fire 2 years prior and had been living at an extended stay temporarily. We chose this particular hotel because of its location. It was rather close to our school and where my mother worked at the time, so it seemed like the right choice. Now, what makes the location so interesting is the fact that it's located in the Meadowlands. Famous for housing Giants Stadium, now Meadowlands Stadium. For those of you who aren't so familiar with the setting, the Meadowlands are mostly swamps and marsh fields. Way back when, before redevelopment on the area began, it was mostly pig farms. So it was safe to say that if you were up to no good and needed something to get rid of, you went here. Hazardous materials, broken down vehicles, even bodies were left to rot in the murky waters of the various swamps. Mostly considered to be the perfect place for murders and rapes. It's even rumored that Al Capone's body is buried somewhere out there. So, with that little bit of back history, I now continue on with my own little tale. I had woken up from seemed like an average dream, gasping for air. The inhales loud enough to wake my mother up who slept in the bed beside me. After a few minutes, I finally regained my composure. I couldn't figure it out but I had stopped breathing. My mother turns to me and asks if I was alright. I reassure her that everything is fine and tell her to go back to bed. At this point I'm wide awake but decide that I need to go back to sleep since it was rather late and I had class the next day. I lay my head back onto the pillow, and as soon as I feel the cold fabric touch the back of my head I felt something else that I would never forget. The unmistakable touch of a finger tapping on my forehead. 2 quick taps. It came fast and felt harsh. I quickly rose and scanned the area and saw nothing. My mother and sister were laying down, sleeping. No one else by us 3 in the room. I begin to freak out and turn on all the lights. Waking up my family, they ask me what's wrong. I explain the story to them but they write it off as a dream. My mother had seemed to have forgotten already that she had already woken up by my odd gasps for air. For the rest of the night, I sat up leaning across the bed frame observing the room until my body couldn't take it anymore. It was too exhausted. From lack of sleep and a shock to the system that occurred twice in one night, it was ready for bed. But as I sat there, dozing off into a sleep my body was screaming for, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wanted my attention. I have a friend who I went to high school with, but never really befriended until college. After becoming friends, we started hanging out on a weekly basis, smoking weed and playing video games for most of the night. We both lived in a small town in Massachusetts at the time. My friend lived next to the town forest. While smoking at his place, it was common to go out to the balcony, which faces the forest. One night in December we're chillin', listening to some Machine Supremacy, smoking on his balcony while it's snowing. When all of a sudden we hear this noise. It was unusual, to say the least, since the trees have always been thick enough to reflect sound from any other houses. We turned off the music and listened for it again, and after about 5 minutes of waiting, we hear it. It sounded unmistakably like a snare drum and some sort of brass horn for a marching band. The drumming was a very precise drum roll, never stopping or changing. The horns just kinda made sounds that started low, then went high and then went low, volume matching the pitch. The sound faded in and out and lasted about 5 seconds each time, and each set always sounded the same. It's the middle of December in New England, snowing with about 8 inches of snow already on the ground. It's about 2 or 3 a.m., and there's a marching band playing in the woods. Creepy. Over time we hear it all through the year, at any time of day, always from the forest, but not very often. Once a week at most. We have non-smoker friends who have been around when they play, and even commented on it. What the fuck is that band doing in the woods? Okay, you may not believe me, but here goes. 2 nights ago I was watching Paranormal Activity 2, and about 15 minutes into the movie, I started getting this deja vu feeling. Like premonition sort of stuff, you know. It was like I knew exactly what was going to happen, like I had already seen the exact same movie before. But I've only seen the first one. So I have no way of explaining what happened. I've talked to other people who have seen the movie, and they all went through the same thing. You're watching a movie you've never seen before, and yet everything is so familiar, like you've already seen the exact same movie before. I have had several precognitive dreams. The first time it happened, I had a dream I was in this mall. It wasn't a mall that I went to very often, so it was kind of weird that I was there. I was with a friend of mine and she went to the washroom. I was waiting for her in front of Sears when a man in a light brown coat walks past me. When I glanced up at his face, it was a slow motion shot in a movie. When he passed by me, time snapped and returned to normal. My friend came back from the washroom and that's when I woke up from the dream. A few weeks later, the friend, same girl I had dreamt about, called me up and asked if I wanted to go to the mall, the same mall from my dream. I still hadn't made the connection to my dream yet. Anyway, we go and hang out. Then she goes to the washroom and I'm standing in front of Sears. That's when I realize and I thought to myself, there should be a dude in a brown coat. As soon as I had thought that, I see a man in a light brown coat approaching me. He walks past me, I focus in on his face, and yup, it's the same guy from my dream. My friend comes back and asks me what the hell is wrong with my mouth. I'm in too much shock to reply. When I got home that night, I told my brother everything and he freaked out. Since then, I've had this happen to me several times. I don't remember my dreams often, but when I do, they're very vivid and I've got good memory as well, so I can remember details fairly clearly from my dreams. I can't explain why this happens or how. Sometimes, I'll get a feeling similar to déjà vu, but it's more the feeling that I've had a dream about my current situation or circumstances. However, I take these instances with a grain of salt. It could just be my mind making a weak connection to something else. But the times where I have a dream, remember it, and then actually experience in real life, I have no explanation for. I saw this when I was really young. I think maybe in the second grade. I was walking to school in the winter and there was a thick blanket of snow from last night. I was by myself because my sister stayed homesick. I looked up and this huge black dark triangle is hovering above me, moving slowly, but no sound. You know how it gets eerily quiet when it snows? I lived in an area right next to an Air Force base, and I knew what jets and planes sounded like. This thing was completely silent. I tried to tell my teacher and some other kids in my class, only one other saw it too. The feeling I had in the bottom of my stomach was fear and relief all at once. I was terrified, but for some reason didn't feel like I was in any harm. I ended up with a triangular birthmark on my wrist and 3 moles centered on my middle finger, my wrist and underneath my wrist that I never noticed a couple days later. Flash forward a few years and I'm in middle school. Around this time my sister would say she saw green lights outside our window, but when she tried to wake me I would never wake up. I thought she was full of it. BTW. I was pretty confident she was trying to get a rise out of me after watching Unsolved Mysteries or something. A few weeks after she starts going on about this, one night I wake up but I can't move. My limbs feel glued to the bed and the harder I try to make myself get up the more pressure I feel. I can open my eyes, and to the left of me I saw 3 to 6 dark figures. They look like wispy shadows, walking back and forth in my room, and it looks like they are looking at me discussing something, but I can't hear anything, but I can tell they are looking at me. The way they moved was windy, if that makes sense. They were there but the movements were so graceful in a way it was unworldly. This happens 3 times in 1 week, and goes on intermittently for about 4 years. My mom had sleep paralysis as a youth, so I attributed it to that. I guess I may be putting things where I please. I wouldn't want anything like that to happen to me, but maybe I just had an overactive imagination growing up. 100% true story. My birthday is in July, so every year I was always able to have a good-sized party or sleepover growing up because no one was in school at the time. On my 10th birthday I invited a bunch of friends over and my parents set up a tent in their backyard for us to sleep out in. The tent was an old-style tent with 2 partitioned areas. The back was covered in opaque and the front half was just screen mesh. Late that night almost everyone was in the back part with a flashlight, and me and one other guy were up front talking. Out of the corner of my eye I see a light. When I turn to look I see an orb, roughly the size and shape of a football, moving at about the speed an adult would walk. It was between me and the house and below the gutter on the 2nd story. It was roughly 20 to 25 feet away from me and perhaps 12 feet or so in the air. It would blink bright and then wink out, disappearing completely, from my eyes anyway. It would then blink back in a few feet ahead, always traveling at roughly the same pace. My friend and I both froze up, completely speechless. When it went out of sight, beyond the back of the tent, we stared at each other and sprinted back and tried to rally the guys to help us go find whatever it was. We got out and I never saw it again. Freaked me the hell out as a child, and to this day I have no satisfactory explanation. Not scary/creepy, but unsettling nevertheless. I get night terrors fairly regularly, and even knowing that, I can still rarely tell when I'm actively having one. This one night, as I was falling asleep, I felt like I suddenly had this glimpse into something that was controlling me, like a puppet. It's super hard to describe in words, but imagine some kind of hybrid of the Truman Show and the person sitting in the cockpit of the robot thing from Avatar, some kind of master puppeteer. Basically, as I was slipping into unconsciousness, my mind gave me a brief glimpse into whatever was in charge of my brain. It was like peering into ground control after a shuttle launch. No alcohol or drugs were involved, so I'm going to attribute this to night terrors, but wow, did that mess with me for a while. Before I start, not my story, but my aunt's. Personally, I'm an atheist who doesn't believe there is a scientific explanation for paranormal activity and would try to attribute most of the stuff I'm about to explain as pure coincidence. However, I do place some trust in my aunt. She's a bright woman, a fellow atheist, and a family-renowned skeptic like myself. That being said, she is absolutely convinced of what happened in her home and recalls it like it was yesterday. I'll try and give details as best I can if anyone is curious. So my aunt lived up in coal country in PA but later moved to Harrisburg. It's a spooky place to begin with, at least in my humble opinion. There has been a fire burning under Centralia for 50 years. To this day, no one knows for sure how it started, and during the winter months you can see the steam seeping up from the ground. The fire ripped through the underground caverns of coal in the town cemetery. Eventually the population dwindled because of the safety hazards. Nothing remains except roads and, if I'm not mistaken, a handful of stubborn people. Anyway, on to the story. My aunt lived up there in coal country with her husband. The houses up there had basements dug into the ground where people would shovel coal into the furnace to warm the homes. Her home was somewhere over a large coal dig. That's another weird fact. People were never sure if miners were digging for coal under their land. Sometimes the ground in the backyards would simply buckle. The man she bought the home from had lost his wife in a tragic accident. She fell down those steep stairs to the coal furnace in the basement. Tragically, he died the same way. Fell to his death down those stairs and died alone, incapacitated at the bottom. So, my aunt and her husband buy this place a few months later and immediately begin noticing odd things. Sometimes, they'd be outside hanging laundry on lines and the radios would randomly switch stations from low frequencies. Low frequencies had several stations my aunt enjoyed, to high frequencies, country. My aunt absolutely loathes country music. At night when the sun went down, the house would creak quite a bit and doors would be slammed around the house when no one was present. Whenever they went into the basement to store some things or clean up, this would get worse. Whenever they made alterations to the house, the oddities only multiplied. One day my aunt recognized these occurrences were having an effect on her mental well-being. They were driving her mad. So, she sat down with her husband and spoke to the man. This sounds weird to me as well, but she explained that they tried to drive a bargain with the old man who they thought haunted the house. They screamed out loud to the guy that they wouldn't make alterations to the house for a few months if he would go peacefully. After 7 to 8 months, he was gone. Several years later they sold that house after it pretty much collapsed in on itself near the spot where the man had died at the bottom of those stairs. Could have been the coal mining below the home causing instability. I had a dream once that ended up coming true, kind of like Ops. I posted it a while back, but I feel like it would be a worthy contribution here. In the dream, I was riding the bus to school talking to my best friend who sat across the aisle from me. She was in the school's band, and she played the flute. She held up the flute case, and there was a big hole in the side, closer to one of the ends. And that was it. That was the dream. I told her about it on the bus the next morning. Hey, I had this stupid dream last night about your flute case breaking. It seemed insignificant, and I don't know why I told her. Later that day, after her band class, she ran over to tell me that someone tripped over her flute case and broke it. She didn't have it with her, so she showed me that afternoon on the bus, and there it was. The hole was the same size and in the same place. Since then, I've had a couple of other dreams like that, but they weren't as vivid and I can't really remember them anymore. I used to live in a very old large house. Over 300 years old. Many people who came to stay had weird things happen, but I who had lived there for years did not really have anything happen. I don't know what to make of their stories. Mainly I just think that they are suggestible and freak themselves out late at night in a big old dark house that makes creaking sounds a lot as old house do. Some range from simply seeing ghosts to far more subtle things. But some really do seem strange if true. One time my uncle was staying. He is well educated and scientific and not prone to tall tales at all. He claims he went to the kitchen late at night to pour himself a glass of water. Having done so, he walked to the other end of the room but dropped the full glass. It shattered, but not a drop of water was to be found anywhere. Very strange, but maybe he simply was mistaken that he really filled up the glass, which is possible if you are still very sleepy. The only thing of note that happened to me was hearing a loud crash from the other room one time. I went through to find a largish log/bit of wood lying on the floor, about a foot long and 4 to 5 inches in diameter. It looked like it was once part of some furniture. I have no idea how it got there. It did not come from anything in the room. There was a fireplace in the room, but there was a guard in front of it blocking it all, but a bit at the top, and the wood was found about 15 feet away. It seems unlikely a bird could have lifted it in the first place, and drop it down the chimney. Birds did nest there though occasionally, and for it to bounce over the fire guard and end up on the other side of the room. There are no overhanging trees, and as I said, it had definitely been used before, in furniture or something, not fresh off a tree. I don't think someone could have thrown it into the chimney either, as it was very high up. Possible, but not the kind of thing people would do in a quiet village, and they would have to have walked far onto our garden to stand a chance. Not sure what to make of that. I was having a dream where I was hunting aliens with Ripley, as in Sigourney Weaver, in a dimly lit room full of inactive industrial equipment. Sounds pretty awesome, right? Well, out of nowhere, she pounces on me menacingly, and her face changes to something really nasty and drooly. Not an alien face, something different. She has these huge teeth, and her face is just a few inches from mine, mostly in shadow but certifiably transformed into something monstrous and out of sync with the rest of the dream. So I say fuck this and force myself to wake up, because I am at this point aware that I am dreaming. But that's not the weird part. The weird part is the silent ball of insects floating at the foot of my bed when I wake up. About the size of a volleyball. Just buzzing around silently. I also feel very weak physically, not paralyzed, just strained, and I'm instinctively trying to shoo this strange phenomenon away from me with my floppy arms and legs. After a few seconds, my blanketed foot manages to push into this ball, and it floats back and disappears into the bookshelf a few feet away. I know I am not dreaming at this point. I do all the checks, stare at your hand to see if it morphs or disappears, double and triple check the clock to see if it keeps the same time, pinch yourself, bite your tongue a little. Nope, completely awake. And inexplicably hallucinating, or witnessing something that is rationally inexplicable. No drugs, no medications, no family history of this kind of thing. No clues at all to indicate a natural explanation for this unambiguous yet bizarre experience. Even hypnagogia does not manifest discrete and reactive objects, only generalized colors and shapes.